Hi, guys, and welcome. I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8. And in this sort of inaugural episode in what I call IntraSubjectivity, I'm going to be describing precisely what this is, specifically in speaking about what I think of as interiority, our inside world, which is what I call intrasubjectivity, referring to cognition itself, which includes thinking, i.e., linguistic, rational thought, as well as feeling and emotions, and the imagination, which is what I'm going to speak about here today. And see, the imagination is very enigmatic and very interesting. And there's a sense in which there's a question as to precisely what thoughts are, feelings are, the imagination is, because we like to think that empirically or in terms of neuroscience that we can locate what that is. And in fact, it is more mysterious than most people realize. And the part that's most interesting to me is the sort of glue, the sort of underlying things that keep thoughts together, the sort of things that hold together the very fabric of our consciousness. There's a sense in which the very unity of our awareness is one of the more fundamental mysteries in nature, given that we have a unified experience of the world. If you've ever known anyone who is schizophrenic, unfortunately, you have known someone that is not blessed with having a sealed up whole feeling of being in reality as a single being. So, what I mean to suggest is that there is a sense in which there is always already, as a philosopher might say, something going on. And it is that something going on that's most obvious, that is, in fact, most fascinating to anyone who's asking questions that, to me, mean anything. And what I mean is that it's questions and a curiosity about what is in front of us, about things that are everyday, that is actually, in fact, the closest to the mystery of being, as opposed to more abstract questions about things that really are detached from the immediate mystery and surreal nature of simple human experience, which I want to focus on as being something that should be cherished and should be privileged. The experience that everyday people have of reality as something worth thinking about and something within which we can find a lot of power and a lot of meaning and a lot of significance, even in a political, ethical sense. It's right in front of us. And so let me step back and explain a little bit about what I mean by intrasubjectivity and the exploration of subjectivity and consciousness itself. What I'm referring to is a broad number of disciplines that go from psychology and science and more analytical disciplines to theology and the history of mysticism and the arts and anything that includes what we think of as the natural exploration or development of our inside world, of what we think of as the inner world of human subjectivity. And I think of this in a weird way because I don't think of as how we experience ourselves in reality as natural. I think of it as having a kind of historical development that in many ways is probably evolutionary psychology on a certain level. But I think that there's a level at which history does detach from biology. I know a lot of people disagree with that, but I think on a certain level, there's a sense in which culture itself has begun playing a different kind of game than what the biological game is, and that's what some people call memetics. But ultimately, the point is that there's a sense in which our subjectivity emerges in history. One of which is the emergence of Christianity itself, which we can't really think outside of, given how much Christianity has taken over who we are. Even if you're an atheist like I am, there's a sense in which you're still shaped by Christianity, even as a background of your being, as a way in which you make sense of yourself as an atheist. Not to give any credit to religious people, but there's a sense in which they have set the norms within which we're ultimately living. And this occurs in ways that are deeper than we really pay attention to. And I think that there's another sense in which historically our subjectivity, and that is our how we feel reality, how we feel our individuality, how we feel ourselves, that Rene Descartes, the French philosopher, was paramount in Europe's creation of what Marxists would call the bourgeois subjectivity or the bourgeois consciousness, in the sense in which it is in many ways a product of the desires and the fantasies of a certain development economically of a certain middle class who develop certain ideals that are fundamental in liberalism, and they're as fundamental as Christianity is in the broader sense that it's almost impossible to think outside of these structures. I do think it's possible, and so there's a sense in which that's precisely what I'm wanting to lead these discussions to. And the reason I point out consciousness as having a particular kind of historical construction in the way that we experience reality is that I want to go even further back than the ways in which our subjectivity begins some number of thousand years ago. I'd like to go back perhaps 100,000 years ago to the development of cognition itself and consciousness, which I think of as being linked to the development of culture. And so we take it for granted, but there's a sense in which culture and our consciousness, the way that we think, even in using language and in using images and in using ways of organizing with other people, that allows us to ultimately thrive and also experience many conflicts. But there's a sense in which that in itself is not as old as we think it is, because I think there's a key word that I like to use that is probably not accurate, but it's the word geophilosophical, which I don't know what it really means, but I don't even care, because what it means to me is that one has a sense of time, one has a sense of geology. Like there's a sense in which even to think philosophically, to have the audacity to think philosophically, one must begin with the humility towards our geological positioning, meaning that human civilization, human life is simply a blip. It's a flash of nothingness in a pan. And there's truth to the idea that nature won't even remember us. And there's a sense in which nature doesn't even know that we're here right now. I mean, and that what that is a sense of real understanding of what we are, even as a species. We're not the center of the stage. We're not the point of the show. And so there's a sense in which one begins with that. And I think that one can even then from there have a very profound sense of what the human being is and what we are. That's very different than how I might have made it out to be, and speaking in this geophilosophical way. I mean, there's a sense in which there is something singular about the human being without being a speciesist about it, as they say. And a speciesist is someone that thinks the human species is somehow significant or different than other species. So that in itself is an enigma, because we are the species describing itself. And so there's something like a horizon that we face in trying to think through that thought. But that's not even the point. Of course, the point is always to lose my point, but to find my way back. Because what I mean to suggest is that IntraSubjectivity is in many ways the umbrella term for my own exploration of this phenomenon in many different ways. And so what I'm wanting to address is one thing at a time. And the thing that I begin with is the thing that got me going when I was in my early 20s. And that was what I thought of then as the problem of consciousness. That's what in philosophy they call the problem of consciousness. And it's not really a problem, except that it's a particular kind of dilemma that arises in our attempts to describe phenomena that have otherwise seemingly different categories within which they can be described, meaning that, in short, the problem of consciousness is that we have a first-person point of view. And the way that science works is I can't remember exactly how I'm trying to say this or if I'm saying it correctly, but it's from a third-person point of view. And so there's a fundamental sense in which no matter how well or how inexhaustibly you describe a particular creature, animal, or a person, you will never know what it's like to be that person. You will never know what it's like to have that consciousness. So this, what is it like, problem is the problem of subjectivity. And so my own exploration of what I call intrasubjectivity is my own attempt to, in many ways, connect myself to this conversation, but also to separate myself. Because I am secular, as I'm sure you can surmise, but I am not what you might think because I have, as many thinking people do, very different ideas about different things. But one thing that I don't really believe is that what we normally think of as our inside world, as being the self within the self, I don't really think that exists. And I'm not trying to say what others, like Sam Harris, might be saying in regards to the self not existing, because I think that in many ways betrays the underlying mystery of the emergence of selfhood, of this interiority, which I don't experience to be in the way that he experiences or describes it. So I think there's automatically a particular kind of exception, to that in the ways in which one might reimagine our very relationship to the question of consciousness. And so what I mean to suggest is that you can begin with a particular kind of secular view, which I have in common with many people, and end up in a very different kind of position. And so, what I'm attempting to do is lay the groundwork for their exploration of cognition, in the form of questions regarding what is thinking. That's a question that seems obnoxiously stupid, like the question that a child would ask. But it is, in fact, a question that isn't profound because it's not a meaningful question. Not once you've read, like Wittgenstein, I think, and worked your way through Western philosophy, it's no longer so much a profound question. Even the question of consciousness, in many ways, is not as mysterious as I thought it was when I set out on this path. But I think that that is besides the point, because the point is that the question itself opens up particular paths in your awareness. I mean, once you ask questions about consciousness, you start paying attention to its phenomenon. And believe it or not, I'm wanting to get to something that is somewhat practical in regards to the most prevalent thing of all, which is this sort of anger or resentment or fear or hatred, that we almost unfortunately take for granted as being natural. And I think there's a relationship between the development of cognition and specifically the imagination and the ways in which we are in many ways living within mental prisons. And I would never want to hear anyone tell me that I was in a prison. So I totally get it. But I know enough about myself to know that I was in a prison for most of my life. And it's not about transcendence. It's not about freeing yourself from the difficulty of being a human being or playing that kind of game. I don't believe in that kind of liberation. I'm too much rooted in Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. I mean, I'll make other videos about him, but I think there's a sense in which if you begin with Kierkegaard as a someone that influences you, you are not troubled by the fact that consciousness itself is fundamentally troubled. That there's an inherent tear in our psyche, as I think it's been said by Pascal, which I begin with. And so there's no illusions about escaping the very anxiety that is in many ways just a part of being aware and being alive. But what's interesting is the degree to which it is so overblown in so many people, or it seems to be something that is just so out of proportion with the facts. And of course, I step back, remembering who I've been, and I'm sort of astonished to see that my vision didn't allow me to see what I couldn't see. I mean, of course, that's obvious, but there's a sense in which if you're not sensitive, at least, to outside information, you'll never grow. And if I give my younger self any credit, it's the fact that I was in many ways wanting to know what I wasn't doing and getting right. And I did not have anyone directly helping me out, lacing me up, so to speak. I had to do this haphazardly on my own. And in many ways, what I ultimately discovered was a very sense of the power of consciousness, of the imagination and thinking, rational thinking. And the profundity of deep feeling of, and there's so many ways you can speak about it, of experiencing and knowing what human feeling is, and the very power that one can feel moving through them at particular moments and for different reasons. And there's something amazing about thinking critically and planning out as much as you can in the difficulty of real life, and actual intention, and then following through and using this thing within our mind that is a development of cognition, of consciousness, for what it is for, which I don't think of as metaphysical or anything like that, but having to do with thinking clearly about options that we have, and then exercising our will to follow through with our objectives and winning those tactical battles. That's a beautiful thing about what our consciousness can do. And there's a sense in which what we do as a species with that consciousness is especially like fascinating and unique. And so it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, there's a sense in which one cannot overlook, what it means to have a opportunity to be aware of being aware. There's a sense in which the very joy and deepness of our life has to do with this self-consciousness, this awareness that we have, in that we can and have great feelings and great thoughts, but also to be aware of those thoughts and aware of those feelings sort of amplifies, magnifies all of that. And so you have to begin with that kind of affirmation, I think. And then I think there's a broader sense in which, one has to see, and I know this is probably boring, but it's amazing to me. And it's that there are parts of our consciousness besides reasoning and feeling that include the imagination. And the imagination is often touted as being this beautiful thing that's sort of like an ornament, or sort of like this thing that is nice because we can imagine things that aren't real, or we can use it to think creatively. Or there's a sense in which, if you're more profound, you might even go into the poetry of Wallace Stevens and William Blake, who are really important to me. And they're poets of the imagination. And what that means is a sort of question that is really, really deep in human civilization and human consciousness. And that is, what is the imagination? And Wallace Stevens and William Blake, in their own different ways, are explorers of this. And it's, to me at least, most rich form. And the philosopher that, in for some reason in my mind this is connected to, is William James, the American philosopher William James, who had written a book in like the 1890s, I think. So it's like 120 years ago. But he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's one of the most important American philosophy books, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he's sort of like an American Nietzsche. William James is. Like, he's in a weird way an American Nietzsche, except that he's healthier, and I'm not the first person to say that, but there's a sense in which what's tragic about Nietzsche is how he never had an opportunity. I mean, he was so broken, and so he's so heroic in spite of that, but he was certainly a broken, hysterical person, at least a lot of the times. And William James, in many ways, had the same kind of intuitions. He's much more cleaned up than Nietzsche, but in many ways he begins with the same kind of fundamental affirmations of Nietzsche. He affirms life, and that's what we love about William James. And I think what he was also aware of was the fact that so much of civilization up until that point had been predicated upon a shared imaginative belief in God. And there's a sense in which a lot of people still do believe in God, and that people had believed then. And there's a sense in which, however, many people who purport to believe don't really believe. And there's a sense in which many, many more people than even that don't believe anything at all. And yet there is, perhaps from William James's point of view, a predilection towards belief in us. We have this will to believe. which has something to do with the imaginative, which has something to do with having a impulsive desire to make sense of things, because the imagination you might think of as not merely fantasy, not merely like just playing around, just horsing around. It's not just about telling stories that aren't true. You might think about the imagination, as I mentioned in my intro, as like a kind of glue that's linking things together. And when you let go of like the belief in God, or you're challenging these underlying beliefs in what justice is and what life is as a society, and fewer people are really subscribing to the dominant beliefs, the dominant narratives, the very threads that hold society together, those become broken, and people begin disappearing into their own sort of individual and cultural points of view. And so then there's a question of how individuals might even begin using that imagination um, in a way that isn't completely self-destructive. And so there's a sense in which this kind of conversation is very fascinating to me, but in many ways, it's it's not really the point, because the point is really to see that the imagination is kind of creating hell for all of us, and there's a certain sense in which we have to learn how to let go of it. And the way that I'm getting to that is by suggesting a few more points, which is that the imagination doesn't only structure society in the way that it creates the sort of backbone behind our belief in institutions and our belief in things like um, corporations and even society itself. Those aren't, in fact, scientific empirical realities. They're beliefs that we all have, that we all agree to believe in. And so that's what I was meaning to get to before I started wandering off. And, I'm never going to be able to not wander in all my thoughts. So some of these videos are going to be longer than others. And I wouldn't expect otherwise from myself. I do sort of have a plan in motion. But in describing IntraSubjectivity as a whole, of course, it'll sort of take me a lot of stepping back. But what I'm meaning to trace out is the history of culture as a whole, and cognition and human consciousness as it developed together. You see, cognition is what exists in us with thinking and imagination, but culture is in many ways the externalization of cognition. And as I mentioned, if you have a geophilosophical point of view, you can see that it emerges and then it's shaped in particular ways. And we ourselves are outcomes. In many ways, we're just, the middle. Everyone's in the middle. It's not the finality. And there's a sense in which there's deep contingency within it, and there's a lot of accidental things. And what is most fascinating to me, though, is the degree to which one thing that we think of as being so powerful and so amazing, which is thinking, and like rational thinking or critical thinking or imagination or creativity. I think that these things are actually extremely limited. And I come at this as someone that has sort of like accidentally dedicated their adult life to thinking and feeling through fine art, through learning how to read poems and learning how to participate in great art, and learning how to, in many ways, practice what Aristotle thought of as that catharsis that comes with the experience of feeling through amazing art. And what I see, though, is that one, it's a double-edged sword, consciousness, and the imagination as a kind of glue that holds things together is especially deadly, because it holds things together that aren't even real. And so where I'm coming from is thinking about the anger and fear and rage that seems to hold so many people together. And it's more and more taken for granted as being a natural disposition, given the perceived state of affairs. And I'd like to question that, because what I'd like to suggest is that there is a sense in which consciousness is extraordinary. Consciousness is also the very source of all of these thoughts that we're always having about other people and about ourselves. And honestly, I don't think they're real. I think that in many ways they come out of this like fantasy space that we live in, we have the luxury of living within. I mean, we live within an excessive surplus of information and ideas and desires and images being repeated. And so there's a sense in which we are overwhelmed with a collective imagination and our own individual imaginations, and it's relentless. And I myself am a highly imaginative person. Like, I in fact struggle with living in a fantasy world. I'm very speculative. I think a lot about philosophical questions that aren't even real. And I sort of begin as someone that has pursued, I think, in many ways, the power of this thing. But I also think that I saved my own life by knowing how to not think and not feel and not imagine. Because a part of my proposition is that one has to let go of the positive in order to let go of the negative. And so I think that we often get caught up in thinking that you should hold on to positive thoughts and that you should hold on to positive feelings, and that the imagination is something that you can somehow wield to make your life better. I think that is mistaken, and I begin with my experience. I'm sort of a disciple of experience. I privilege that as a way of testing philosophical ideas. I test by experimenting, by being alive, by simply being here. I am testing, no matter how abstract or ethereal or lyrical your ideal or idea is. I'm here to test it by experience. And, there's a certain level at which I think you should begin from that point of view too. And I think what you discover is that a lot of things that people think are true are not true. And that includes things that I've believed my whole life and things that I probably believe now. In fact, they are the things that I think now. I suspect that, on a certain level, we ought to be agnostic about all of our beliefs. And yet, I don't mean to pretend that one can like live in a state of skepticism. That's a whole other question regarding epistemology and the philosophy of skepticism. But what I mean to suggest is that I can speak from my experience, right? And so there's a couple of things. One is that I could not have been told that it would be possible to have an experience that wasn't one within which I was thinking and feeling and imagining. I'd spent most of my life in a concentrated state of tenseness, because I was wanting to be prepared, I was wanting to be ready, and I thought of um, life as being only like that. And if I was challenged with the idea of living in my senses, or living without being angry, or being depressed, I would have been accusatorial towards that person. I would have attacked them. In many ways, I can already hear like the kind of things that I would have said. So I know precisely why one wouldn't want to be told that your issues, like your problems that you think are your problems, like those are not your problems. And that's what I would not have been. That's what I would not have been wanted to be told. Like I would have taken that as smug, as condescending, And I think there's a level at which any dignified human being would reject that kind of like accusation. But I think on another level, it would behoove you to, even if you react in that way, to step back and at least think twice about the degree to which you are really benefiting from thinking that you can plan out your future, or from thinking that you know who you are, or that you know what is that you know what you're doing, or that you know what life is all about. I mean, there's a fundamental sense in which we feel like we're losing something when we let go of all that. Like we feel like we're losing control, and we feel like we're losing the joy of life, and we're losing the point of life, which we are in many ways probably rightfully so told to think. But I think on a certain level, it works really well. That is imagination and feeling and reasoning until it doesn't. There's a sense in which it's only the particular people, like you're the particular person who exists. And so you have to ask yourself, like, is this working for me? Because there's certainly a degree in which, there's a strong sense that a lot of people need to learn how to think. They need to learn how to practice critical thinking to figure out their lives because they're hurting other people by not making better choices. There's a sense in which people need to think clearly about the jobs that they have and the careers they have and what they're doing with the time they have. And there's a sense in which a lot of people need to wake up and have feelings. And that's certainly the case. That's why you have to begin where you're at. I began as someone, and I'm responding to myself probably, as someone who was unable to let go because I couldn't imagine that there was anything to be gained. But what I found is that life will force you to let go at some point. There's a sense in which, like, you will be humbled and you might not experience it until your last moments, given that you might be saved by other people, or you might be protected, or you might have like sort of a safety net that keeps you from really falling. But there's a sense in which it's only by falling and on a certain level not being saved that you are saved. Because what's really crazy is that even when you're not thinking, things work out. There's an astonishing sense in which life is working itself out through us. And we play this egoistical game where we sort of think that we have something to do with this. And like I said, some people do need to exercise their willpower and critical thinking. But there's a sense in which it's absurd not to see when this isn't getting in its own way. And so I am of the belief that who we really are, that once you really know who you are, in the sense in which it's not even knowledge, it's a deeper sense that you feel in your bones, you sort of become untouchable in many ways because you're sort of freed from the very game that exists in the shared imagination of all people in society that really isn't real. And it's amazing because we sort of have to believe that it's real in order to function in institutions in life, to use language. We speak about things that aren't real because it in many ways offers organizing principles, because the background in everything that I'm saying is the sheer complexity of modern life and civilization itself. It sort of involves these heuristics, these like really reductive, simple ways of thinking that we employ. But then there are exceptions, and being sensitive to those exceptions, I'm realizing now in speaking this, is a part of what thinking is. Because so much of thinking relies on general rules, and you can see how those would be very helpful. But what's most ignorant is to ignore the exceptions. And there's a sense in which in certain traditions this is the priestly prophetic kind of tension, but I think that there's perhaps a more fundamental sense in which within us, within our psyches, we are asymmetrical. We live in a fantasy space that isn't even imaginative. I like to think of fantasy as the negative thing that's like purely made up and ultimately unhelpful. But the imagination is something that grows out of an organic kind of consciousness. And so there's a sense in which whenever you can live without the imagination and live in your body as the self that you are, without an identity, without being associated with society or being associated with the imagination of the self, which gets in the way of the real self. And what I mean by imagination of the self is the very identity that you might be holding on to, or the very sense you have about your own future and your own past. All of that is all hogwash. And like I've said, life will in many ways humble you in its own way. Or you can perhaps find your own way to being humbled. And I don't mean to say that I know anything, but I think there's a sense in which if someone is listening for this, it's like a lock opening up, like this could be a key opening up a lock. Because the door that's being opening is in many ways to the greatest thing of all, which isn't consciousness. Like we think of, as I said earlier, self-consciousness as being the great thing, right? And so when I began my study of consciousness a long time ago, I was in love with what's called self-consciousness, self-awareness, which in many ways is taken to be what I mentioned to be the problem of consciousness, the problem of having a first-person point of view. And it's sometimes called complex consciousness, and it's juxtaposed in philosophy and psychology to simple consciousness or naive consciousness or um, sensory awareness. And so philosophers will distinguish between our basic awareness that we have of the world that isn't really self-aware. It's really the kind of awareness that all animals have. And it's sort of taken to be a basis of biological life is consciousness. But the way philosophers think about it is that there's self-consciousness, which I kind of suspect now to be um, not the crowning jewel of consciousness, of life. In other words, I think we get the cart before the horse, that self-awareness, that is being aware, and practicing this kind of pursuit of imaginary, abstract ideals. It is a complete betrayal of what is really rich, which is simple consciousness. And so there's a sense in which philosophers and intellectuals completely overlook what is most valuable from the get-go. I mean, by believing that thinking itself is somehow where life is at. I mean, I've been doing that for a long time, and I can tell you that I think real thinking is actually like through the eyes. It's through the skin. Like real thinking is a sensory activity. Like real thinking is, in fact, an intuition. That's what Aristotle had called it. And so there's a sense in which I begin with the sense of thinking as not being inherently language. And this is a controversy within philosophy. Like, do we think in language? It's a question of semiotics, of semiosis. And so I'm sort of the position that that we have a consciousness that is not language, and that it is a simple awareness of the world. And this sounds absurd to anyone that hasn't studied philosophy, who sort of already begins with that proposition or preposition that the sensory life is real, the physical life is real. But I mean to press a point that perhaps you, though, are still not really using that perceptual consciousness as much as you could. If you have frustrations, if you have issues, if you have anger, if you can't let go, that's indicative of an imagination that still exists. You know, even if you think that you're just aware and you're not controlled by thoughts, it's amazing how our thoughts control so much of what we say and what we think and the fantasy space that we end up living in. And sorry, I'm getting messages on Facebook. And I think that when you know how to live without it, you can do it better. Like, that's a part of the point I'm making. You can use your imagination better and your thoughts better when you can go a good part of the day without using it. And I think that a part of what I think of as the practice of IntraSubjectivity is learning how to have a relatively decent relationship to this self. And a lot of what IntraSubjectivity is a deeper exploration of this phenomenon and what it can mean. And not to get too off point, but I sort of reject the idea that there is an essence within us, that there is a self within us, which I had suggested. But I think that there's a more profound sense that has been pointed out by others in philosophy and religion, which is that the inside world that we think of as like in our skulls is actually outside of us. And so there's a sense in which the interior is actually the exterior. And so if you want to know who you are, you should pay better attention to the world around you, including other people. I think that's a great jumping off point, in the sense in which you can begin to explore other people precisely by exploring yourself. And so there's a sort of tension, like a sort of question that is really fascinating to me intellectually. And it's if you begin with like an objective point of view of the self biologically, um, you run into this question of where depth exists in the human being. If we were just brains, if we were just animals, how do we have this deep, rich sense of I-ness, that my life is so meaningful, that there's some story going on, that there's something so powerful? How do you let go of that in the name of buying into a more reductive model of human consciousness, which is perhaps what they call epiphenomenal? I'm sort of an epiphenomenalist in that I see consciousness as being a glittering um, epiphenomenon of the brain's existence. And yet I'm torn by being literary and having an existential sense of inwardness that is amazing to imagine as not being as vividly real as I take it to be. That's a question in itself that perhaps there's an impasse. But like I'd mentioned earlier, these questions might seem pointless, but they certainly have an effect in terms of like orienting us in terms of the questions that are like a quest. I hate to play on that pun, but it's sort of like a quest. And there's a sense in which I am astonished to find what I discover in lieu of this quest. And one of the things I've discovered is how my anger towards myself was driven by something that isn't even real. Because when I am paying attention, I can see myself going through the motions that used to make up like who I was. Because one doesn't simply get over who they were or what they were, but there's a sense in which you sort of learn to lovingly observe yourself passing through yourself and disappearing, because it's sort of like a ghost that you're letting die again. And so I'm sort of amazed at how much one is freed from this idea that you have all these problems and all these issues. Because I think that's what I was meaning to say earlier. The actual problem is, as they say, it's in the heart. It's inside of who you are, your attitude, um, your very sense of, maybe not your attitude, but your very sense of what is real. Because all of that stuff out there and everything you think about other people isn't real, but everything you think about yourself isn't real, and who you feel about yourself isn't real. That includes the positive and the negative. The positive in many ways is the very cause of the negativity, and there's a sense in which this circularity is what destroys us. And I think what saves us is returning to perception, to the eyes, learning how to see, how to actively use our hearing, learning how to pay attention to people when they talk to us, how to think deeply about what they're saying, but not in a way that is pretending to be deep or pretending to be ironic or anything like that. But there's a sense in which we're paying attention to ourselves, paying attention to them. And there's a sense in which that's precisely the depth, actual depth, that observation opens. And when we're not living in our imaginations, in our minds all the time, even though on a certain level we have to. I mean, the emergencies of our lives are calling forth feelings and thoughts. But I think on a certain level, one has to get perspective, at least for a moment, on this, so that you can see that the very issue that we have is in many ways in our very strength, in our very power. And as I mentioned earlier, it really is a kind of double-edged sword. And it's astonishing to me to see what consciousness is and how precious it is, and how taken for granted it is. And I think we can simplify things in order to see that on a fundamental level, once you let go of your imagination, you get through that sort of great fear that you have that you're going to be losing something that is making your life so meaningful. And yet, what you suddenly discovered is that life itself is meaningful in itself in a way that then allows you to play on it, since you have this kind of control that comes through a disciplined imagination. And I know that a lot of this sounds really convoluted, probably, and I am always a bit circuital, circuital. But I think that learning how to let go is powerful, because it doesn't mean that you're not thinking or feeling. I mean, obviously, that's what I do. And so I'm speaking to myself as someone that is always already automatically thinking. And yet I've saved myself by being able to see that this very activity is minuscule compared to what life is. But it's amazing to wake up and read like I do, and then to write, and then to try to speak. But it's only amazing because I know how to stop thinking, to open up my eyes. And as I mentioned earlier, to see that what I thought of as the inside world as being so meaningful is actually secondary to what is sublime, which is people, other people, the world, things that are going on. You know, it has nothing to do with me. And of course, it has something to do with me because there's always like a first person point of view. But there's something amazing about the moment when it sort of clicks and you realize that other people are alive and other animals are alive, and the world um, that is beyond you is exhilarating and worth understanding and trying to pursue, even if you never have a comprehensive total understanding of it or any certainty about anything. You discover that the real richness of life is found in precisely, the opposite way of living and thinking than how many of us have been raised to think. And that, like, the greatest triumph could perhaps be practicing, you know, a simple kind of life where you're not so overwhelmed by your imagination and your thinking and your feelings that you can pay attention. And it's amazing because when everybody else is like losing their shit and going crazy, you can be chill and centered, knowing again and again, as I think reality proves itself, that there is a surprise like waiting for us. That's what, on a certain level, revelation means. And again, I'm an atheist, but I think it's extraordinary how, in asking questions, like, the truth will show itself. And that means something for intellectuals too. And being able to see life beyond thinking and feelings and your own egocentric point of view is more powerful than any imagination, which is probably over exaggerated in our culture. I think that there's a sense in which clarity is more profound because life itself is more interesting in many ways than even what our imagination can do. And so I think I'm going to leave this here as being my first little attempt at explaining what I think of as IntraSubjectivity. And I sort of have another word, which is IntraObjectivity, which refers to the reality of other people and the reality of social institutions and sort of the elaborate different kinds of games that organize our exterior imagination. And by exterior imagination, I mean the world of society that we all agree upon. And I think of interobjectivity as being the inverse of intrasubjectivity. So intrasubjectivity, for anyone that cares, is, as I said, the study of cognition. But interobjectivity is the study of, in many ways, culture itself. And yet it doesn't really limit itself to culture because interobjectivity is the external world in all of its depth and all of its fullness. And I think that if you go far enough into yourself in whatever way you do, and there's a lot of ways to do it, through drugs, through adventures, through great conversations, through great books, um, sleeping, taking walks. There's so many ways to go into yourself. But I think what you find if you go into yourself far enough, long enough, is other people. Because I've always thought that there's a analogy between Einstein's conception of the bounds of the universe as being boundless, in the sense in which if you go far enough out into space, you turn back around and come back to where you are. And so that kind of like circular boundless space is how I conceive of the interior world of subjectivity and selfhood. I think that if you go far enough into yourself, you come back out, like I said, to see that reality is outside of us, and that there's something to be said for the traditions in theology that go back to, Germany in the 13th century, that began to recognize these sort of underlying psychological injunctions about the actual nature of our inner life. And in speaking of the study of consciousness, my favorite subject early on was phenomenology, which is the philosophy of direct perception. And it's a way of philosophizing that begins with experience, without too much self-consciousness, experience without words, experience as it presents itself. And there's different ways in which you can take it. You can take it as Martin Heidegger did, or as Husserl did, or as Merleau-Ponty did. And so those were sort of like my first favorite philosophers. And so I come back around to seeing that what phenomenology was doing was in many ways a very confused way of doing something that is in fact more fundamental. And in many ways, it's precisely what literature and poetry has been doing all along in its better forms, which is rescuing the flesh. Art itself in many ways has played and stepped in and played that role, because philosophy has so lost touch with the body. And there's a sense in which the body itself, like the earth, that's what's being lost. Like that's what is really meaningful, is the reality of having a skeleton and blood and a functioning nervous system, and being in a world that we are a part of, that we are an expression of. We are enveloped in the earth. Like the atmosphere is the earth. There's a sense in which we are wrapped up in this, and yet we are, in a certain degree, blind. Like we are oblivious to this, and distracted from it. And I surmise that the very gift of civilization and culture and consciousness, the very thing that has gotten us to where we are, in many ways has to be mitigated by the deeper like reservoirs of who we are. And so that's sort of like what I'm calling upon in my own little wavering introduction to intrasubjectivity. And so I was just wanting to originally talk about how the imagination and darkness are related. And by darkness, I mean the world that I lived in most of my adult life until I was like 32 years old. And I assumed that it was real, that it was permanent. I assumed that it was who I was, this darkness, which was like hatred on a certain level, anger, but self-pity, depression really badly on another level. I assumed that that would be forever. And yet for like 10 years now, I've been more and more free from it. It doesn't happen overnight. And there's a sense in which there's a lot of layers within us. You're always entering new layers. And so it's a process. But I do think that there's a sense in which you would be ignorant to assume that you're not going to be surprised by stepping towards a path where you can see the truth, literally to see the truth rather than think the truth, in the sense in which you can sort of realize that although thoughts are very helpful, the imagination is very helpful and powerful, it's ultimately really not helpful when it comes to experiencing life, including its darkness, including its pain, because the imagination protects us from that pain, and what we have to do is go into the difficulty of that pain, go into that interior world where we are not afraid to perceive anything, to think anything. We're not afraid to feel anything. We're not afraid to admit who we are and what we've done, because we know that it's not really as real as we thought it was. There's the power that comes with undoing the imagination, is sort of like in The Wizard of Oz when it's uncovered, that the wizard is not who we thought it was. And I think that a lot of our pain and a lot of our problems and our fear with other people, if we were able to go into that, we would discover that it's not really what it was. It's not what we thought it was. In fact, it wasn't the problem. It wasn't the issue. And there's a sense in which we have to go within ourselves. And I don't know what that means. I don't have much interest in psychiatric practices or really like thinking about this in an analytical way. I think about these things in an urgently literary styled way, which really just means that I think about it in a personal kind of way that I hope to work or transform into some kind of material that can be helpful to others. And that's why breaking this down into a conversation about what we take for granted as being real will ultimately determine what we experience as being real. And so you should think twice about what your imagination and your thoughts and your feelings are creating for you. And especially if you're allowing yourself to believe into all the positive and excessive expectations you have about what life is and about who other people are. I think that there's a sense in which human nature, including who you are, is really buried beneath that, buried within it. And I don't think it's a bleak conclusion. I think it's a starting point that is so freeing. It's hard to put into words, and yet, like I said earlier, I wouldn't want to hear anyone telling me about what is freeing or what isn't freeing. So I don't even really know why I'm recording these thoughts, except that it's sort of like putting a message into a bottle and throwing it out into the ocean. I have like 9 subscribers at this point, so I'm sort of really throwing, bottles into the ocean and sort of practicing as much as I can while I can precisely what it is that I love, which, believe it or not, is thinking. And I love the performative, almost jazz-like, improvisational, spontaneous quality of thinking that's demanded, that real thinking demands. I have a few notes, but I love improvising thinking. But I also begin with the reality that thinking is very serious. And one thing that I'm flummoxed by is the degree to which so many people are cynical. They don't think anything matters, or they have a flippant attitude. They're sort of unaffected by anything. There's a sort of irreverence that I find to be quite painful. And so I think our world demands thinking. Like, it's because we're not really thinking, and for 75 years on a certain level, we've largely given up on trying to think clearly about the very crises that we're facing. And so that's an element of what I do. But one can't do this if you're sort of destroyed by it, or if you take it for being something it's not. And so I think the point that I'm going to leave this with is that Philosophers always confuse two things. They think about how thinking should be, but they don't really think about how thinking already is. They don't really begin with an honest assessment of who they are as people before they're philosophers. I mean, this is apparent in the ways that we often advocate a grotesque, idealistic conception of what human nature is. And so I think if you begin with a fundamental sense of what rascals we are, like what funny creatures we really are, it's a lot easier to see the degree to which we're also sometimes heroic, sometimes reasonable, sometimes confused, oftentimes, you know, like a little insane. There's a sense in which one has to like keep all of this in track and allow yourself to have some mercy on others by having mercy on yourself in regards to challenging at least your ideas about not who you are, but the very thing that makes you think about who you are, which is your imagination. So I'm John Edward Willie, and this is my first little shot in the dark with my attempt to explain IntraSubjectivity. I love you guys.